the kind of the cool thing, but it's also sort of a catch-22 about something like paleontology, is that there there's always new stuff coming out of the ground. I'm in my second semester as a PhD student in Shesh, and my approach is evolutionary anthropology. Well, the dinosaurs are obviously the sexiest thing in the mix, but turtles have been around for about 160 million years. So they were around, as you know, before the dinosaurs, a long time before the dinosaurs were. So yeah, and they kind of they give you a different sort of insight into the environments that they came from. So the turtles are generally going to be give you a better idea about the quality of the water and the presence of water. They're much more dependent. Most turtles during that time were aquatic. Turtles didn't become fully terrestrial or even like remotely arid adapted until the Eocene, so probably about 50 million years ago. So that earlier turtles were very, very aquatic relative to today. Research on them has sort of been driven by conservation, I think, more than anything else. Like marine turtles, living marine turtles have been studied a whole lot just because they have a public appeal, like everyone loves them, and they they've kind of become a poster sort of group for climate change and things, and it's just that they're a very charismatic group of turtles. But yeah, there's a lot that's not known, and turtles are extremely diverse, and have been for a long time. So they occupy nearly any. I mean, really, they're only limited by temperature. Wow. So that's the biggest thing that kind of keeps them latitudinally constrained, and always has. But they're really that's what makes it possible. I mean, they've changed really, essentially not changed a whole lot in the last 100 million years. There are turtles in these 90 million year old sites that are you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between them and a living relative of theirs. And so I became aware of a local organization called the Southwest Paleontological Society, and they've been around for about 30 years now. So it's a volunteer organization that has worked closely with the Arizona Museum of Natural History for a couple decades, and they've served as the repository for a lot of fossils, and got to know them, and they learned that I worked on turtles, and they were like, wow, we have turtles, and I was like, I would love to see them. And so it kind of became an organic thing, and they were like, well, we don't have anybody who really knows anything about turtles, so do you want to study this stuff with us? And it's like, sure, this is great. So we went out into the field, and then became aware that they had collected their previous material. So SBS, and in particular, one of my co-authors, Doug Wolf, who's on the paper, he's been working in the Zuni Formation for decades, and he's been involved with the dinosaur finds that have come from that formation in New Mexico. And they've been published over the last probably 25 years. So he's sort of the Zuni expert, and he was the one that was taking us and showing us around in the basin. And so he had been talking about the things that had been previously collected, which wasn't a ton, but he actually didn't know because nobody had really looked closely at the turtles. Went through and looked at what they had from the Zuni that they had collected, and I found this specimen. It was almost guaranteed to be something important because of the age of the deposit. So it's about 90 million years old in an interval of time in the Cretaceous period, called the Turonian. So it's early in the late Cretaceous, and it falls before kind of the biggest, most famous North American dinosaur assemblages had developed. So it's sort of an intermediate, it's a transitional age. So you have things that were largely less diverse and more small-bodied at the beginning of the Cretaceous. And then by the end of the Cretaceous, everything had gotten much larger, everything was more specialized, everything had adapted better, and dinosaurs were really much more, they really like dominated everything by that point. But this kind of falls right into the lead up before we see the big giant specialized crazy T-Rexes and things. So we've pretty much all the fauna there are some kind of transitional thing. The other thing that's important about this time period, in addition to it being different than the things we're most familiar with, is that it comes after a significant faunal incursion, I guess, or an invasion of Asian species. So there was a land bridge that opened with the sea level fluctuations, and there were dinosaurs, there were turtles, there were mammals, I believe. There were a bunch of things that came across from Asia, right pretty much in the middle of the Cretaceous. So they had collected it and had prepared it at the museum, meaning kind of cleaning it up and gluing it back together and stabilizing parts of it that were kind of falling apart. And it was notable because it was one of the more complete specimens that they had collected. The age of the Moreno Hill Formation, where it came from, like I was saying, was there's very, very few deposits of that age. So it's automatically kind of a rare thing. And this was remarkable because it was, most of the plastron was there. And actually they had previously identified it as a bayanid turtle, so belonging to the family Bayanidae, which is an extinct group of endemic North American freshwater, mostly river turtles. So sometimes they lived in lakes, but for the most part they lived in river channels or like streams, some kind of flowing freshwater. They were very aquatic. They were carnivorous. And actually, here's my reconstruction of Edowazuniensis, and they resemble sort of generally modern terrapins. So like the chicken turtle from the East Coast and the diamondback terrapin in the Northeast coastal plains are somewhat similar in terms of the shell and just the skull anatomy. Bayanids are only really weird in a couple ways fundamentally. First of all, their shell is totally fused. So normally in a turtle shell, you would be able to find sutures between the particular bones. There's dozens of bones that make up the shell. So when something fossilizes and then falls apart, it tends to come apart at those sutures more easily than like if more easily than breaking the bone or the rock that's formed the bone. And the other, so they're completely fused. So that was, they couldn't see any sutures on the specimen. Bayanids are really pretty common, although we didn't know during this time what was going on with the Bayanids, because there were no Turonian Bayanids known from the continent. So we knew they were there because they had been on the continent since the early Cretaceous, and we know that they were very, very successful afterward. So this fills a gap of about 12 million years or so. It's only one specimen, it's only one data point, but it gives us some insight into what was happening with this group of turtles at the time.